Hello everyone. By the end of the 8th century, as medieval Europe was slowly emerging from the Dark Ages, people coming from the north, by sea, began to launch unexpected raids against coastal towns and villages around the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. In a few decades, they went always farther, adventuring as far south as Spain, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, and as far east as the Volga River. In some regions, they attacked and looted, only to disappear as fast as they had arrived. In other regions, they settled. They also explored, from the vast steppes of what would become Russia to the cold waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, all the way to Iceland, Greenland, and America. These people were Norsemen, that we also call Vikings. We will see where the term Viking comes from. European chronicles of the time depicted them with a mix of fear and condemnation, because they were looters and merciless warriors. They were also pagans, at a time when many of the regions they attacked were populated by Christians. The fear of the Norsemen only receded in the 11th century, as they had settled and assimilated in regions out of their cradle in Scandinavia, and progressively Christianized. The particular way other Europeans came into contact with the Norsemen during the Middle Ages strongly influenced historiography. For a long time, even centuries after their raids had ended, they were seen as mere barbarians, until the beginning of a revival in the 18th and 19th centuries, a revival that sparked interest in their culture and made non-Scandinavians realize that they also had an original culture that had formed long before the Middle Ages. This revival period also gave us new stereotypes or myths about the Vikings, stereotypes that are still very much alive today. I will tell you a little bit about that too. But just to give you an anecdote, an example, the way they are often pictured with helmets that have horns on them, horned helmets, is an invention of the 19th century. There was no trace of such helmets in contemporary descriptions or in archaeological remains. The way they are also often depicted as violent warriors, predominantly, is also very narrow. No society can sustain itself only on warfare. They were also farmers, fishermen, hunters, craftsmen. They had a complex society, and the majority of them stayed in Scandinavia, in what is now Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. So tonight, we're going to take a look at the history, the culture, and the societies of the Norsemen, where they came from, why they suddenly expanded out of Scandinavia, how this changed the world, and left a trace from Russia to Normandy and Great Britain. This is going to be an overview of the Viking Age. So make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath and relax. We have a lot of things to explore. I also made a story about Norse mythology, if you are interested in their myth and pantheon. A story you can find on my channel. I will put links in the description, and also re-edited and narrated by Sarah, my American alter ego, on the new channel and podcast we recently launched, Lights Out Library. You will also find the links to it in the description and the first comment pinned under this video. I also invite you to check my Patreon page if you wish to support this channel. Between other things, it helps keep the channel free of ad breaks, even before videos. And if this is more convenient for you, you can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, and other audio streaming platforms. After a few months of delays due to technical problems, releases of new stories are back on these platforms. I just had one about the history of submarines released. The history of the Silk Road will follow shortly. So audio streaming will quickly catch up with what you can find on YouTube. But for now, all you have to do is let me tell you the story. And it begins more than 1200 years ago, when the sails of Viking ships began to multiply on the Baltic and the North Sea. Traditionally, the beginning of the Viking Age is dated to 793 AD, when an attack took place against the Abbey of Lindisfarne in England. At the time, an important center of learning, where possibly dozens of monks lived. It was located off the coast of Northumberland, in the north of England, near the frontier with Scotland. The monks were thrown into the sea or carried away as slaves. The abbey was looted, and the Norsemen disappeared. This date, 793, was chosen because this attack was impressive. But it was not necessarily the very first one. Archaeology reveals that there were already contacts earlier in the 8th century between Scandinavia and Great Britain. The same with the southern shores of the Baltic Sea, which were close to Scandinavia, what is today Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. These raids only intensified in the following decades. They reached new regions, and along the 9th century, the Viking scare spread to many coastal regions of Europe, and even inland, because on their ships the Norsemen also sailed on rivers, and they could attack settlements dozens of miles away from the sea. But who were these warriors? What did they look for? And why had they begun to explore out of Scandinavia? The Norsemen, or Norse people, had settled in Scandinavia centuries earlier, in antiquity, as a branch of Germanic peoples, collectively with the Celts, the Greeks, the Italic peoples, and many others. They were part of Indo-European peoples that migrated in successive waves from the steppes of Eurasia, starting thousands of years ago. I already told you about this ancient migration in various stories, so I am not going to repeat everything. but Indo-Europeans generally strongly influenced the regions where they arrived, mixing with the locals. We don't exactly know how peaceful this was, but it happened, and they brought with them cultural traits that became dominant in their new homelands, their various languages, their belief systems, or their social organizations. Depending on the geography, the climate, the history, or the local cultures they were influenced by, these peoples formed different cultures along the second and first millennia BC. Their languages diverged from others. In a process that was not straightforward, they often migrated several times and in different directions, sometimes encountering other peoples of Indo-European descent and mixing with them. We don't always know the exact ancient history of these migrations and mutual influences. But what is established is that around 2000 years ago, Nordic peoples that occupied the Scandinavian peninsula had acquired enough cultural specificities to form a common area, a cultural area. Why consider them as a single cultural entity? Because apart from similar social structures and customs, they also spoke the same language, Proto-Norse, the ancestor of Old Norse, the language that replaced it later around the 8th century, at the time of the Viking Age. Old Norse became in turn the precursor to the different languages spoken today by the Swedes, the Danes, or the Norwegians. And for that reason, these three languages share a lot of words and structures. So the Norsemen were at the same time an ethnic group, descending from Indo-Europeans and the local prehistoric population of Scandinavia. And they were also a linguistic group. They spoke the same language. It didn't mean they were united politically. For example, in the 9th century, the largest Norse state in existence was probably in Denmark, but it barely covered half of modern Denmark. It was centered on the Jutland Peninsula, the part of Denmark that is connected to the continent. At the same time, in Norway, it is estimated that around 30 different small kingdoms existed, probably a consequence of geography. Norway has mountains and fjords that create as many natural boundaries. In terms of technology, Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th century was on a similar level to Western and Northern Europe at the time. We see it in metalwork, the houses they built, their crafts. But there is one field in which the Norse had acquired a big advantage, in sailing technology. And this is what made their seafaring and raids possible in the first place. These developments include the use of larger sails and navigation techniques like tacking, for example. That is to say, turning the bow of a ship toward and through the wind, so that the direction from which the wind blows changes from one side of the boat to the other, and this allows progress on a sailing boat toward a destination that is into the wind, which otherwise would be impossible with the wind against the ship if it tried to advance in a straight line. So the Norse were good sailors, and they had a long tradition of building ships, especially these long ships that are also sometimes called dracars. The design of these long ships evolved for a long time. The oldest traces of them that archaeologists found were from the 4th century BC, more than 1,000 years before the Viking Age. It is logical that the Norse were drawn to the sea. To travel, trade, or go to war in the fjords of Norway or in the islands of Denmark, the sea was often the fastest and easiest route. Norse longships were made of wood, obviously, with woven wool cloth for sails. And an advantage of these ships is that they were at the same time relatively light and very stable. They could work on seas, oceans, and also on rivers. This made them perfect for raids. They could embark a few dozen men. They could work whatever the weather, except really big storms. But because they had a large sail and could also be propelled by rowers, they were very adaptable. These ships had a shallow draft. They could navigate in waters only 1 meter deep, only a few feet deep. So this allowed landing on almost any beach. And because they were light, they could be quickly carried out of the water to secure them, and sometimes use them upside down as shelters. There were different types of longships. Some were small, and the dracars or draki, dragon, were the largest ones, with 30 rowing benches or more. In Norse sagas, the stories and histories written in the Middle Ages, there are accounts of spectacular dracars, but it is uncertain they ever existed, because no archaeological remain of them or proof of existence was ever found. But regardless of whether these super long ships ever existed or not, the point is that at the time of the Viking Age, the Norse certainly had the best ships in Europe, and without them it is unlikely they could have traveled that far from Scandinavia. Why did they decide to expand or explore like this in the 8th century, after so many centuries of staying on their lands? What are the causes of this Norse expansion? There was probably a combination of reasons. One could have been what I just told you about their sailing technology. The innovations they introduced made these long-distance raids possible, and they did them because they could. But there were other possible factors. Another one could have been political. In the decades before the Viking Age in Scandinavia, the very decentralized political organization that had prevailed for centuries began to change. Larger kingdoms emerged in Sweden, in Denmark, even in Norway, despite its geography. And these new states expanded. They grew at the expense of many independent chieftains that were forced out of their lands. If they refused to submit, they had to find refuge or resources elsewhere. This could have motivated many of them to start raiding Western Europe, the British Isles, or to start exploring for new land, as the only possibility to remain independent. and in Western Europe, they found states that were very decentralized and weak, without navies able to oppose them or land armies that could oppose their attacks. There were also many isolated religious sites, abbeys, monasteries, that were defenseless. So politics and the organization of states in the 8th century could have been a major factor. At the same time, Viking raiders were pushed out of Scandinavia and pulled to the rest of Europe by attractive and easy targets. Yet another factor could be the demography. Along the 8th century, there could have been a demographic boom in Scandinavia, and the lack of agricultural capacity would have made it necessary to look out beyond their ancestral land. Now, this explanation that is often used as a hypothesis to explain migrations is a bit uncertain or controversial, because there is no proof that a demographic boom ever happened in the decades before the start of the Viking Age. It is possible, but it could also just be a cliché. It is obviously hard to know how many inhabitants there were at the time in Scandinavia, but one estimate I found of the population in European countries around the year 1000 suggests a number between 1 and 1.5 million. 500,000 in Denmark, 400,000 in Sweden, and 200,000 in Norway. For comparison, at the same time, the whole of Great Britain would have had about 2 million inhabitants. Italy had 7 million, Germany 5 to 6, and France 9 million. So it is true that Scandinavia did not have large expanses of cultivable land, but it was still relatively scarcely populated. A Norse kingdom with a few thousands or tens of thousands of subjects would have been already rather large. Because they didn't really have the numbers, the Vikings always operated in small groups rather than large armies. Except in very particular cases, they just couldn't field armies of several thousand. So, the demographic explanation is uncertain. Another factor that sounds probable is the economic explanation. The 8th century around Western Europe and the Mediterranean saw increased prosperity. After the disaggregation of the Western Roman Empire, Europe had fallen into a long period of demographic and economic decline. This period, called the Dark Ages. Trade collapsed in the 5th century, and regions that were connected by roads and the same administration became isolated. On these ruins, a new society organized around local chieftains, local lords, slowly formed, over several centuries, a feudal type of society that would reach its final form later in the Middle Ages. In the 7th or 8th centuries, this transformation was taking place, and many communities, villages, or chiefdoms still lived almost in economic autarky. They lived on the food they produced, and they traded very little with the rest of the world. Large cities had almost disappeared from Western Europe, and most of the population lived in hamlets, in villages or occasionally small towns. Along them, Christian monasteries had grown, either near villages or isolated. Standards of living and general wealth was still well below what it once had been under Roman administration. But in the 8th century, there was an improvement, modest but real. Some towns, sometimes new towns, grew. Some monasteries became more prosperous. They typically owned land that they exploited. An example of this in Anglo-Saxon England at the time is the development of towns that worked as emporiums, settlements that had a significant trade and artisanal activity. Don't imagine something big. At most they had a few hundred inhabitants, but in comparison with previous centuries, there was a little movement of concentration of wealth in some places, the beginning of re-urbanization, and these were as many attractive targets to sack. Before the Viking Age, there were occasional trade connections between Scandinavia and these towns, so the Norse knew their existence, and they could probably notice that their prosperity had increased. Further south, in the Mediterranean Sea, the Islamic world had also consolidated after its fast expansion, and with it, so did trade routes that helped push a bit of that wealth further and further north. The Vikings also noticed that, and later they would also venture to Spain and North Africa that were under Muslim control at the time. So the economic appeal of regions to the south of Scandinavia could also have been a factor. And finally, one last hypothesis about the triggering of the Viking Age is an ideological or religious factor. By the late 8th century, Christianity continued to expand to the north and to the east of Europe through a mix of conversions of pagan populations and wars. For example, in 772, so that's 20 years before the attack on the Abbey of Lindisfarne, that marks the beginning of the Viking Age, Christian Emperor Charlemagne, who ruled over France, the Benelux, northern Italy and the west of Germany, launched a campaign against the Saxons in Germany, who were pagans. And the Saxons would be converted by force along the following decades. So the pagan world was shrinking, and occasionally missionaries would travel to Scandinavia, trying to spread their faith. Here again, this is hypothetical and we lack elements of proof. But the beginning of raids could also have been a response to the perception of a threat, or the threat could have justified them. That makes a lot of possible factors behind the triggering of the Viking Age: technological, demographic, economic, political, ideological maybe. And it is likely that a combination of these factors explained this sudden interest in expanding, which was not a decision taken by a particular state or a council of Norse people that did not exist. Rather, it was a broad movement that an entire cultural and ethnic group got invested into. So now, let's take a look at how things unfolded as the Norsemen became increasingly adventurous. Until around 830 AD, Viking raids mostly targeted Iceland. There were also attacks against England or the north of the empire of Charlemagne, but Iceland was a target of choice because it was less defended. In England and the Carolingian Empire, the empire of Charlemagne, there was always the risk of finding garrisons, troops that would fight them off. But after 830, the Carolingian Empire fractured. The laws of the Franks regarding successions did not let the firstborn son inherit everything. The inheritance was shared between the sons. So even a successful kingdom or empire like Charlemagne's would not survive the death of its ruler if he had several sons. This made the political map of Western Europe unstable. So the Carolingian Empire vanished, and as the Vikings launched bigger raids with several ships and more warriors, England also became almost defenseless. From 830 and for several decades, it became almost open bar for the Norse. They could land wherever they wanted in these parts of Europe, sack and disappear, or sometimes stay and establish bases. They did that in the 9th century on the coasts of England and Scotland, and in the 10th century in France, in the region that is now Normandy. From Normandy, they could navigate on the Seine River, deep inland, unchallenged, and attack cities like Paris. In practice, regions like Yorkshire in England or Normandy in France became Viking colonies. In France there was no hope of expelling them anytime soon, so the Frankish king of West Francia, the western part of Charlemagne's empire that later transformed into the Kingdom of France, so the king, Charles the Simple, acknowledged the situation and dealt with the Norse. Their chief was Rollo, a chieftain of Danish or Norwegian origin, it is uncertain. The king granted him the title of Duke of Normandy and full right on this land, which was attractive because it was fertile and in a strategic position at the crossroads of northern and southern Europe and in front of Great Britain. In return, Rollo swore fealty to Charles the Simple, which made him one of the main lords of the kingdom, and he pledged to defend it from attacks by other Vikings. This deal happened at the beginning of the 10th century, in the year 911, and the Normans, now established in Normandy, started to assimilate. They converted to Christianity, and over a few generations their language switched from Old Norse that they abandoned to the Norman language, which was a Romance dialect, a dialect of French. And they prospered in Normandy. Their descendants kept this adventurous outlook. Normans worked as mercenaries in other parts of Europe, especially in the south of Italy, where they ended up establishing fiefdoms. I told you about that recently in the story about the Crusades. And of course, in England, that the Duke of Normandy, Guillaume, William the Conqueror, invaded in the 11th century. Western Europe was not the only region the Norse were interested in. Most attacks in Western Europe were carried out by Norsemen from Denmark and to a lesser extent from Norway. But the Norwegians also explored the Atlantic, and they colonized different islands: the Shetlands, north of Scotland, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, that they reached in 982, and all the way to Vinland in America. Vinland, this American colony, was known only through the sagas and medieval historiography for a long time. So historians had doubts that the Norsemen had actually reached America, until 1960, when evidence of a Norse site was discovered on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada, proving that the Norse had crossed the Atlantic centuries before Christopher Columbus. But their colony, or maybe their colonies there in America, only one was found, but maybe other existed. Their colony did not prosper. At an unspecified time, it died down, or they all left. And there is no trace of further exploration inland in Canada. The Norse who lived in Sweden looked more to the Baltic coastline and to the east, towards what would become Russia. And there too, they had a major impact on these regions. Norsemen who settled or traveled to the east are also called Varangians, and they contributed to shape the history of Russia and Ukraine. In 859, a chieftain called Rurik, from the tribe of the Rus, R-U-S, would have conquered or be invited to reign in Novgorod, in the north of western Russia. Would, because Rurik is semi-legendary, he might have existed, but his name only appeared in chronicles 2 centuries later. But what is certain is that this region of northwestern Russia fell politically to the north, and from there they went further south to Ukraine, where they founded the state of Kievan Rus by the end of the 9th century. Kievan, because its capital was Kiev. The population was Slavic. Their impact in this region cannot be overstated, because the Kievan Rus became a powerful state of the Middle Ages that persisted until the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. And the Kievan Rus is regarded as the historical predecessor to the Russian and Ukrainian states. The Rurik dynasty continued until the end of the 16th century, when it was succeeded on the throne of Russia by the Romanovs. Following waterways, the Norse reached the Black Sea to the south of Ukraine, and from there Byzantium, with which they established trade connections. Some of them even served as mercenaries in Byzantium, employed by the Eastern Roman emperors. Through a trade network that crossed Ukraine and Russia, goods from Byzantium reached Scandinavia, and some of them were even transported to the west. For example, Byzantine goods and coins may have reached Britain via this network in the 10th or 11th centuries. However successful it had been in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Viking expansion began to stall. First because locally defenses had been put in place against them, with some success. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Saxons or the Slavs had begun to train mobile cavalry forces to react quickly to Viking attacks. At sea or on rivers, the Norse were untouchable, but they had to move on land too. And against foot soldiers, a cavalry force had the upper hand, the advantage of mobility, which made it harder for Viking invaders to fight inland. Sometimes they were spotted in time and confronted. This happened in 884 in East Frisia, in the northwest of Germany. A small army of Danes was defeated, and this put an end to their attacks on this region. Another way of dealing with them was through assimilation, as we saw in parts of Russia or Normandy. Once established as rulers in foreign lands, the Norsemen no longer wanted piracy and attacks on their doorsteps, so they fought against it. But rather than warfare, it is a political and cultural change that ended the Viking Age. The rise of larger centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia and their conversion to Christianity, which accelerated in the 10th and 11th centuries. As I told you earlier, there were many small kingdoms or chiefdoms in Scandinavia, and they had their rivalries, leading to infighting, to battles between Norsemen. Kings in Denmark, Norway, Sweden tended to be expansionist, to try and unify bigger and bigger territories, and this had existed for centuries, including before the Viking Age. But when some of them converted to Christianity, it added to the animosity by turning these wars into cultural or religious conflicts. Ultimately, Christian kings won everywhere in the three countries, and old Norse beliefs declined sharply, to the point of going extinct in the 12th century. Nordic kingdoms that were now Christian were strongly influenced by feudal states from the rest of Europe. Their conversion connected them to a religious area that now covered most of Europe, and the culture of exploration and raiding that had prevailed for generations disappeared in this new order. Even though they kept different languages and traditions, Scandinavian populations became bound to Christian Europe, and their kingdoms now played by the same rules. The taste for long-distance expeditions did not fully disappear. The maritime tradition lived on, and Scandinavians participated in the Crusades, for example. I also told you about that in the story about the Crusades. But there was no longer these independent chieftains ready to launch expeditions beyond the seas for profit or expansion. Different dates for the end of the Viking Age have been proposed by historians, but they all are in the 11th century. In the following centuries, Nordic chiefs retained some of their conquests out of Scandinavia that were retaken by force. For example, the Western Isles and the Isle of Man, between Great Britain and Ireland, were still under Scandinavian control until the 13th century. Or Scotland took its present form when it regained territory from the Norse between the 13th and 15th centuries. Until 1469, Orkney and Shetland belonged to the kings of Norway. So it was not all settled in the 11th century. But the large raids and the Viking scare that came with them ended in the 11th century. The perception of Norsemen in history has always been very influenced by external looks, because even though they had an alphabet and described themselves on rune stones, that is to say, engraved rocks with runes, they produced no literary legacy. The sagas, or texts called the Eddas for their mythology, were written later, after they had been Christianized. The Norse were also feared and rejected by European populations they threatened. They attacked a lot of monasteries and churches, so they became an archetype of violent, uncivilized, and pagan barbarians. This perception stayed for a long time. It lasted until the 18th and 19th centuries, when the interest in pre-Christian cultures and a new appraisal appeared. One that also had its biases, but different biases. With the influence of Romanticism, the Norse were increasingly pictured as noble warriors with a strict code of honor. It is also the time when clichés like the horned helmets I mentioned at the beginning appeared. The rediscovery of their mythology, with colorful stories, creatures, and gods, also excited some people's imagination. Norse myths became a major source of inspiration for fantasy literature. But beyond that, as we have seen, the Norsemen were much more than warriors. They farmed, they traded, they had a complex society. So let's take a look at that. What was it like to live in Scandinavia 1200 years ago? First, their society was divided into classes, and there were three main ones: the thralls, the carls, and the jarls. The first one, the thralls, was the lowest ranking class, and these were basically slaves. They could comprise as much as a quarter of the total population, and the thralls belonged to other people. They worked as servants and farm workers. They were also employed for heavy construction work, like roads or fortifications. New thralls were supplied by the sons and daughters of thralls. They were born into that class, or by capture. In raids, prisoners would be made and either taken back to Scandinavia or sold. One of the trades that the Vikings put in place was to take them to the Mediterranean and sell them to the Arabs in exchange for silver. Slavery was widespread in Norselands, totally accepted, and it ended only with Christianization that condemned it. The second class, the Carls, made the biggest part of the population, probably more than 2/3, and these were free peasants. They owned farms, land, cattle. If they were wealthy enough, they could also own slaves, but the majority of them didn't, and they were the ones who produced the food and turned into foot soldiers in expeditions. Finally, on top of the pyramid, were the Jarls, the lords, the aristocracy of Viking society. Jarls owned large estates, long houses, horses, and often many slaves that made their estates work. They were in charge of administration, politics, warfare, and they took the initiative to go abroad on expeditions. Sometimes when they died, their thralls would be sacrificed and buried next to them to accompany them in death. People were born into these classes, but the classes were not completely closed, it seems. Occasionally someone could descend as punishment or rise for distinguished service. There were also systems of mutual obligation between individuals. On top of their social class, people belonged to communities around a certain trade, around the ownership of a sea vessel, or they had military obligations to a certain lord, to a certain leader. There were also assemblies in villages to which free people participated. There were local courts of justice. There were religious leaders and a religious calendar in each community, and also special councils called the Things to discuss important issues and decisions. So as you see, society was complex. Like in other traditional societies of the time, women were subordinate to their husbands and fathers, and they had very little political power. Their situation also depended on their social class, but overall they may have had more rights than in the rest of Europe. For example, they could inherit from their husbands, and occasionally, if they were unmarried, widowed, they could become heads of a family or clan leaders. This position would be transferred to their new husband if they remarried. A woman that did not get married after the age of 20 was considered a free subject of rights, like a man. A woman could also divorce her husband and remarry, something that was unthinkable at the time in Christian Europe. Now, these were the rules, the law, but in practice, most free women from the Carl and Jarl classes were housewives. Marriage gave them a social standing and a degree of economic security. Being single was possible, but precarious, and it may have been frowned upon socially. Someone's social standing, their class, was immediately recognizable in their appearance. Men and women of the Jarls, the aristocracy, were typically well-groomed, quite far from the disheveled appearance that they are sometimes depicted with, and they showed off their status by wearing expensive clothes, often silk that came from afar, and a lot of crafted jewelry. Brooches, belt buckles, necklaces, arm rings. Most of these pieces were crafted in Scandinavia, with refined patterns that showed the craftsmanship of the Norse at the time. Archaeological finds suggest that the taste for grooming and hygiene was developed, and not just for the jarls. For example, in tombs of jarls and carls, it is very common to find combs of all quality. Their food was also rather diversified. There were different kinds of meat products. Meat could be boiled, fried, grilled, cured, or smoked. There were plenty of seafood, bread, porridges, dairy products, nuts, vegetables, berries, fruits. Of course, it depended on the location and harvests that were not always favorable. But overall, archaeological discoveries point to a relatively healthy population compared with the standards of the time. In average, men were 1.7 meter high, that's 5 feet and 7 inches, and women 1.55 meter, that's 5 feet and 1 inch. For the time period, that was a relatively tall population. They dressed in clothes made of linen and wool. Flax was a very important crop for the Norse. It provided oil and food, and importantly also, it was a raw material for the production of linen. They also had an important wool production that served for clothing and also to make sails. They also fancied a number of exotic products that they obtained from trade. Apart from silk that came from Byzantium and was imported in really large quantities, silk was found in many tombs. There were spices, glass. Glass was often made into beads for decoration, and wine from Germany and France that complemented their production of beer and mead. To pay for these valuable imports, they sold amber, that is frequently found around the Baltic, fur, slaves, as I mentioned earlier, and textiles. The Norse were skilled spinners and weavers of woolen clothes. These are just a few traits, and there was much more to Norse culture and everyday life. But as you see with all these crafts, their art, the variety in their diet, their customs and complex society with laws, their writing system, we are far from the uncultured society that chronicles of the Middle Ages and after depicted. We are probably equally far from the society of free, brave and noble men that the romantic vision of the Vikings brought in the past 2 centuries. Starting with the word Viking itself, it is used today as a synonym for Norse, and the etymology of the word is still discussed. But the term Viking was launched in English in the 18th century, at the time of the Viking revival, to name the warriors coming out of Scandinavia. And during the 20th century, by extension, it came to name all the Scandinavian population of the Viking Age. So that now when we hear the Vikings, we think of medieval Norse, but before that they had different names, Sometimes they were called Scandinavians. In northern Germany, as Comani, literally ashmen. In Ireland, Dubgale or Fingale, meaning dark and fair foreigners, respectively. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain called them Danes. The Franks in France called them Normans. And as we have seen before, they were called Varangians by the Slavs and the Byzantines. With the end of the Viking Age, paganism went extinct. The Scandinavians lost their reputation for ferocity as they joined Christendom, and the Norsemen entered history as their Old Norse language kept evolving toward modern Scandinavian languages. Vegetation covered the rune stones, and the memory of their gods, their rituals, their adventures, and their worldview slowly faded. We have reached the end of our historical journey for tonight. I hope it makes you want to know more about the Norse. I'll be back soon with a new one, and in the meantime, you can close your eyes and let yourself go. Or, if you don't feel sleepy yet, pick another story from my library. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.